2/3 of kids have been through something terrible by the time they hit 16. Something they'll never forget. Something that rewires how their brain handles fear, trust, and safety. And most of them are sitting in your local public school right now, trying to focus on algebra while their nervous system is stuck in survival mode. Here's the question nobody's asking out loud. Can we actually prevent violence in schools not with metal detectors or armed guards, but by teaching kids and adults how to heal from the trauma that's already broken them? Let's back up. For decades, school violence prevention looked like a hardware problem. Locks, cameras, threat assessment teams. We acted like violence was something that came from nowhere, something random and unpredictable. But neuroscience has spent the last 20 years screaming at us that this is wrong. Trauma changes how a child's brain processes the world. It makes them hypervigilant, reactive, defensive. When you've been hurt, you're primed to hurt back. The real question isn't how do we stop bad kids from being bad? The real question is this: can we actually interrupt that cycle by helping traumatized kids heal? This study wanted to know if we've figured out how. Scott, Stilwell, Murphy, and their team at the University of Michigan spent months doing something called a scoping review. These are the researchers who run the Institute for Firearm Injury Prevention. They weren't messing around. The study landed in school mental health in 2026, and what they did was systematic. They were looking for evidence across 2 decades of research, 20 years of studies from 2004 to 2024, asking one specific question: does teaching schools to be trauma-informed actually reduce violence? Here's what they did. They searched 5 major academic databases looking for peer-reviewed studies about trauma-informed interventions in American K through 12 schools. Not opinion pieces, not think tank reports, actual research with actual data. Then they had to filter those studies through a really specific definition of what counts as trauma-informed. They used a framework from researchers named Avery and colleagues that basically says a program is trauma-informed if it's built on understanding how trauma affects the brain and behavior. It's not enough to just talk about trauma. You have to actually structure the intervention around healing. They weren't looking for anecdotes. They were looking for evidence. And after going through everything, they ended up with 7 studies that met their criteria. 7 solid pieces of research showing what happens when schools actually try this. What they found was striking. The 7 studies they identified, all measuring trauma-informed interventions in different ways, all pointed the same direction. Schools that implemented trauma-informed approaches saw measurable reductions in violence. That's not a maybe. That's not a trend. That's a consistent signal across independent research efforts. Now let's be real about what that means in actual numbers. We're not talking about violence disappearing, but think of it this way. If one school without these programs sees 15 incidents of student-on-student violence in a year, a comparable school with genuine trauma-informed practices might see 9 or 10. That's 5 fewer incidents, 5 fewer kids getting hurt, 5 fewer moments where a traumatized kid acting out gets pushed further into the criminal system instead of toward help. The specific programs that showed results included social-emotional learning curricula, basically teaching kids to recognize their emotions and manage them, multi-tiered school models that intervene early and often, and culturally relevant programs that met kids where they actually were, instead of imposing a one-size-fits-all approach. The key insight wasn't that any single program was magic. It was that schools treating trauma as central to their mission, not peripheral, changed outcomes. This wasn't about finding the perfect worksheet. It was about fundamentally shifting how staff thought about kids who were acting out. Here's what this actually looks like on Monday morning. A kid comes to school after a weekend where their home wasn't safe. Their teacher doesn't see a behavior problem. She sees a kid whose amygdala is flooded with cortisol and adrenaline. Instead of detention, that kid gets connected to a counselor trained in trauma response. The school has policies that ask why before they punish. They have staff who understand that aggressive behavior often means I'm terrified, not I'm bad. That's not soft. That's neuroscience-informed practice. But here's where we have to be honest. 7 studies is a real finding, but it's not huge. These weren't massive randomized controlled trials. This was a scoping review, which means it's mapping the landscape, not providing absolute proof. And the researchers themselves would tell you that the quality and size of these studies varied. Some measured violence reduction beautifully. Others had smaller sample sizes or shorter follow-up periods. You also have the classic question, does correlation equal causation? Schools that implement trauma-informed practices might also invest in better teachers, smaller class sizes, or healthier communities. Which one is actually doing the work? The evidence points to trauma-informed approaches, but it doesn't prove they're the only thing that matters. This finding sits in a bigger conversation that's been building for years. Neuroscientists know that adverse childhood experiences, trauma, literally reshape the architecture of developing brains. Psychiatrists know that untreated trauma predicts worse outcomes for everything from school performance to criminal justice involvement. But schools have been slow to act on this knowledge. We've organized around punishment and prevention without understanding prevention requires healing first. What this study is really saying is that the assumptions we built school safety on might have been backwards. We thought the problem was bad kids. But the research keeps suggesting the problem is hurt kids who haven't been helped. That's a completely different problem that requires completely different solutions. And here's the thing nobody's asking. If we know this works, why isn't every school doing it? The single most important takeaway here is this. Violence prevention in schools isn't actually about preventing violence. It's about preventing trauma and healing the trauma that's already there. And if that sounds soft or naive to you, remember that the data points the other direction. So here's the question that should keep you up at night. How many violent incidents in schools could we prevent if we treated healing as seriously as we treat metal detectors? Turns out, scientists have been busy, and they're not done yet.